It is exhausting watching TV, isn't it? It's exhausting. This guy said this guy said that, what about this, what about that? I mean, it's full employment for slip and fall lawyers or former federal prosecutors. And it's exhausting. And the media not only won't help in terms of getting through this, the media stokes it. And so I feel it's time to step back and take a serious look at some of this. Rudy Giuliani has said that, from his perspective anyway, the President of the United States will not sit down with the special counsel and his team for questioning because there really doesn't seem to be any basis for it. The President is free to fire Comey. The information Mueller appears to want can be gotten from other sources. So what's the point of the President sitting down? And he's exactly right. But there's more than that. As you know, here on this program, I was the first to point out, 18 months now, I guess, that according to the Department of Justice's official position, a sitting president cannot be indicted. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what law professors think. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. The official, formal position of the Department of Justice in two memos, one during the Nixon administration, one during the Clinton administration, neither of which has been changed in any respect, is that the President of the United States cannot be indicted while he's in office. Even if you think that's constitutionally unsound, that is the position of the Department of Justice. Mr. Rosenstein, as the acting Attorney General for these purposes, must comply with the position of the Department of Justice. Even more, Mr. Mueller, as a condition of accepting his appointment as a special counsel, must comply with and enforce the rules, regulations, and procedures of the Department of Justice, just as if he was a United States attorney. So then the question is about these sub-issues. If a president of the United States cannot be indicted, according to the position of the Department of Justice, for what purpose, then, is Mr. Mueller, an employee of the Department of Justice, questioning the President of the United States? To issue a report? Well, he's not in business for the purpose of issuing a report, even though he issues a report to the Department of Justice when he's completed. So what is the purpose of questioning the President of the United States? Is it because they want to discern something? They want to learn more information? Then that should be very straightforward. There shouldn't be a need for all this back and forth debate and discussion. Just give them the 10 questions or the 5 questions and they'll answer it. But Mueller doesn't want to do that. One thing is for sure, the purpose of the special counsel is not to serve as an individual who provides a requisite case for impeachment. That's not his job. He's a prosecutor. He's a prosecutor. Now, if I'm wrong about all this, I'm not. But if a court rules that I am, if the Supreme Court rules that I am, then it gets incredibly complex. If the Supreme Court says that the President of the United States must sit for an interview by his own subordinate, then the Supreme Court has to tell us what the conditions are. Are there no conditions? Are there some conditions? Must it be in front of a federal grand jury? Can it be the sort of interview that Bill Clinton acceded to? The issue is about the details at that point. How would such an interview be handled? Is there a subject matter limitation? Or is it open-ended? Is there a time limit? Or is it open-ended? And as process issues arise, as objections arise, Who handles that? You go into federal district court, that can be appealed to a circuit court, appealed to the Supreme Court. Just how far does this go? To what extent is the Supreme Court going to sit as a trial court at this point? Now that would be a horrendous usurping of our constitutional order. Horrendous. In that case, the Supreme Court itself would become incredibly powerful, more powerful than it is even now. So this isn't just about an interview with the president. This is a complicated matter. It could become even more complicated. And the Constitution could be further damaged by an irresponsible prosecutor, a special counsel by the name of Robert Mueller. I would counsel the president and his lawyers, as I have from day one, do not sit down for an interview. Mr. Mueller isn't even investigating a serious case. We're now down to whether or not there was one meeting, two meetings, Don Jr. was there, did Trump know about his son's meeting, didn't he know about it? None of it matters. None of it. None of it's criminal. Mr. Mueller's investigation isn't an investigation simply to determine the extent to which there were meetings with Russians and so forth and so on. He's a prosecutor. He's not an ombudsman. He's a prosecutor. You either have a prosecutable case or you don't. And he may not like this. And his subordinates may not like this. And former federal prosecutors may not like this. And federal judges may not like this. But it is the position of the United States Department of Justice that a sitting president of the United States cannot be indicted. And if Mr. Mueller tries, he has violated the rules, the position of his superiors, of the United States Department of Justice. He's not free to do that. Moreover, in addition to that argument, the president's lawyers can make the constitutional argument. Now, what constitutional argument can they make? The very argument that the Department of Justice has made to itself on two occasions. On two occasions. That's the first point. The second point, and I'm sorry that Kellyanne Conway's husband is such a knucklehead, but that's his problem, has been raised by Professor Calabresi and me, which is, given the power that Mr. Mueller is exercising, extraordinary power, more than any United States attorney that I'm aware of, negotiating with the president's lawyers on whether or not he will be interviewed in a criminal case. No U.S. attorney has been doing that. He is clearly a principal officer of the United States government. An inferior or subordinate officer of the United States government wouldn't even be in a position to negotiate with the president's lawyers about an interview. Would not even be in a position to do so. Say, well, what about an assistant United States attorney? The assistant United States attorney couldn't do this without approval from the U.S. attorney. So in many respects, Mr. Mueller sits as a U.S. attorney, but actually more powerful than a U.S. attorney. Now, you'll listen to some of these TV lawyers, former judges in some case, and they'll tell you, this was decided in Morrison versus Olson in 1988. This was decided 30 years ago. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. This special counsel is different than all the special counsel before him. There's not even a federal statute, as with Ken Starr in the independent counsel statute. He was appointed by the Deputy Attorney General, serving as the Acting Attorney General. And the appointment was flawed from the moment it was issued. It was way too broad, and there was no criminal foundation. And it's only gotten broader since. And you have an individual in Robert Mueller who has the capacity to create a significant constitutional problem, a constitutional crisis in this country. An inferior employee of the United States government cannot do so. Cannot do so. He has far more power than an assistant attorney general at the Department of Justice. He has far more power than an assistant Secretary of Agriculture. He has far more power than the vast majority of presidential appointees who require confirmation by the United States Senate. And I will continue to make the case that this was a flawed appointment by Mr. Rosenstein. And Mr. Rosenstein has failed to keep this public official within his governing limits, and thereby violates the Appointments Clause of the United States Constitution. And that is a very, very crucial provision of the United States Constitution, or the President of the United States could appoint virtually every single senior official, including cabinet and sub-cabinet officials, without going to the Senate for confirmation. This special counsel is different than the other special counsel. This special counsel is different than previous independent counsel. He is the most powerful that I've ever seen. And his authority is not statutory. So they can't even rely on that. This is the kind of discussion that's necessary all over cable TV. This is the kind of discussion that's necessary all over talk radio, in the columns of newspapers, in blog sites, and so forth and so on. Because in the end, this is what it's going to come down to. Not getting into the weeds and listening to every harebrained argument. Mr. Manafort goes on trial tomorrow in the Eastern District of Virginia. Mr. Manafort goes on trial for events that took place before he was campaign manager to Donald Trump for 4 months. For events that occurred before Trump even announced that he was running for president of the United States. To further underscore the point I just made, why is Mr. Mueller prosecuting Mr. Manafort when that could be handled by a United States attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia? Why is Mr. Mueller subsuming the position of the U.S. attorney, taking this case in lieu of the U.S. attorney? If I am Trump's lawyers, and I know they listen to this program, this is yet more evidence, and significant evidence, that Mr. Mueller is a principal officer of the Department of Justice, not an inferior public official. He's a principal officer. Because now he's stepping in the shoes of a United States attorney to prosecute Mr. Manafort. I'll be right back. If you're concerned about our constitutional order, what's left of it, if you're concerned about separation of powers, if you're concerned about the ability of a president of the United States to do his job while in office, then why wouldn't you raise these concerns? Why don't the media raise these concerns? The Democrats raise these concerns. The never-Trumpers raise these concerns because they don't worry about it. They're not concerned about it. They'll find some outlier lawyer or outlier professor who will dismiss all this, and they'll embrace it because they want to. It's not whether I think a sitting president of the United States can be indicted. It's whether or not the Department of Justice thinks so. Now, let me add another point. The Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, recused himself as to matters involving the campaign in Russia. But the Attorney General of the United States is doing a grave injustice to the Constitution and the nation by sitting silently on what are these significant constitutional issues. And if they're decided the wrong way, it'll have grave implications for the future of this country. There is no reason that Jeff Sessions can't step in, not to get involved in the investigation per se, but to get involved in the nature of these constitutional questions. And yet he's silent, absolutely silent. I've never seen anything like it. There is no reason that Congress, created under Article 1, shouldn't hold hearings and call Mr. Mueller to testify, not about the specific evidence he has or thinks he has, but on these constitutional questions. For Congress to sit there and allow this thing to potentially explode without participating in this is unconscionable. Instead, we have 4 Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee, Grassley and Graham included, who voted to protect Mueller. This isn't about protecting Mueller. This is about the Constitution. Nowhere is there, or should there be, a roving prosecutor. Nowhere, or should there be, a man of this kind of power who is a public official who wasn't confirmed by the United States Senate. And yet the Republicans, they control the place. They just sit there, or worse. I'll be right back. Now, when you hear somebody like Trey Gowdy or Paul Ryan say, let Mueller do his job, or let the investigation take its course, these are people who have very little knowledge of what's going on here constitutionally, or don't care. In other words, let Mueller do whatever Mueller's going to do. Why? Why? Is he some kind of a god? I don't understand that. Is it not possible that he is exercising or may exercise authority that he doesn't have? Why would Congress sit back? Should we pretend he's the former administrator of the EPA? Would that excite them? No, you don't let him do his job or let the investigation take its course if the course is leading into a serious constitutional problem. We expect Congress to step up. And Congress should not confer all this power on the Supreme Court. Congress has a role. It is a co-equal branch. Congress created the Department of Justice. Congress funds the Department of Justice. And I might say the same thing about the FISA court. Congress sits there. These judges on the FISA court did this country a very serious injustice in approving the FISA warrant 4 different times. Now, I understand the difficulty in holding hearings. I understand the Democrat Party is the party of obstruction and evasion. So create a special committee with certain members of Congress, including some Democrats. A smaller committee, not with 40-some members. That might make it a little bit easier. Maybe, maybe not. But you and I know McConnell's not about to do it, and Ryan's not about to do it, because these are not constitutionalists. And neither are Trey Gowdy and the rest of them who parade across TV land. Donna, Frederick, Maryland, the great WMAL. Go. Donna, are you there?
What keeps ringing through my head is how deep this scandal actually goes. The one I'm referring to, which is Spygate against Trump, which is the cover-up of Hillary-gate against America and Obama-gate against America. And that's what gets lost in all the mishmash of the media that we're subject to day out, day in, day out, endlessly. And I want to thank you for just kind of honing in on the subject and giving us the details that we're not privileged to get from this lousy mainstream media.
Well, I'll tell you this, Donna. there's a couple things going on here that we sort through all the time. We talked about Trump and Russia and all the rest of this. And yet you're quite right. On the other side, there are no prohibitions to a criminal investigation of what Hillary Clinton did. And, of course, they conducted a phony criminal investigation and her multiple violations of the Espionage Act. Can you imagine if Donald Trump had done any of that? They'd be hanging him from a telephone pole by his feet right now. Now, that said, there was no special counsel appointed to investigate that side where the FBI interfered in that investigation to protect her, as well as what the FBI at senior levels did in the case of Trump. Now, do you want to know why a special counsel wasn't appointed?
Let's hear it, Mark.
Because it would have been investigating the FBI and the Department of Justice and certain intelligence agencies. That's why. Can you imagine letting loose a special counsel on those departments?
It would have been crazy, but it is now.
So they would not want a criminal prosecutor with 17 other prosecutors, basically an entire United States Attorney's Office. That's what they've recreated here. Investigating Mr. Comey, Mr. McCabe, Mr. Strzok, Ms. Page, and all the rest of them. Investigating Loretta Lynch, Mr. Orr, and others, Sally Yates over at the Department of Justice. Investigating Mr. Brennan and Mr. Clapper and Ms. Rice and all those people who would have been investigated and all would have gone broke, spending millions of dollars defending themselves. That's why Mr. Rosenstein has chosen not to appoint a special counsel in a case where there is a criminal predicate, and yet where there wasn't one, he appoints one. All right, my friend, I appreciate your call. Let's go to Tom. Tom's River, New Jersey, Sirius Satellite. Go.
Hey, Mark, good to talk to you. I think you just hit on what I'm about to give a sermon on. The Democrats, they got their finger in the dike, and they're just dragging their feet. They have to come up with something because everything on their side is like jail time. Everything they've done is like, it's obvious jail time, and they have to come up with something, and that's what we're going through. And thanks for talking to me, Mark. You're great.
All right, Tom, appreciate your call, my friend. Let's go to Mike. Olney, Maryland, the great WMAL. Go.
Yes, good morning, sir. Listen.
Good morning. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Olney, Maryland.
Well, it's not morning. It's evening.
Yes, it is evening, and it's Olney, Maryland in Montgomery County.
And it's happy hour where you are, but go right ahead.
Yeah, you're correct on that issue. Listen, why is it the President of the United States exercising his power to fire Jeff Sessions, to put someone else in the place as Attorney General? That person would then subsequently fire Rosenstein.
All right, why do you think he won't do it?
That's a good question.
No. You know the answer. Why won't he do it?
He's afraid of the backlash.
And what's the backlash?
The backlash is these crazy progressives that are going to make noise. So what? Let them make the noise.
No, the backlash. You say so what, sir? We've been through this with the Saturday Night Massacre several decades ago. The media hate his guts, the Democrats hate his guts, and half the Republicans in Congress hate his guts. They will impeach him and remove him from office. That's why he won't do it.
Well, that's a darn shame because, this Mueller and his investigation, he's investigating the...
So basically we right now have a rogue Department of Justice for many purposes. We have a rogue special counsel. Congress won't step up, and the media are all for it. And so that's the situation we're in. It's very, very dangerous.
I would take the aggressive point and just say
No, you wouldn't, sir. You've never run for anything. He's put everything on the line. You haven't.
Well, that's true.
No offense, but I mean, everybody sits at their dinner table and says, if I were president, what I would do. But you're not.
Yeah, you're right. But
listen to me, please. Can you imagine what this man has been put through? What his family's been put through? What his staff has been put through? And everybody willy-nilly, well, if I were president, I would... All right, thanks for your call. No offense, I'm just pointing it out that I think that would be a bad move. I think what he does is he fights this Mueller all the way through the court system, and hopefully there's some justice. I'll be right back. You see, ladies and gentlemen, if an attorney general or deputy attorney general can appoint a special counsel with no criminal requisite whatsoever to investigate a president because they feel pressured to do so by the opposition party in Congress and by the media, that will fundamentally alter the way our government functions, or does not function. And we now have people in the government, some in the bureaucracy, some in Congress, and we have people in the media. We're rooting for that outcome. They do not want a president like Trump or conservative or Republican presidents to be successful. So they want to constantly dog them. They want to have this new precedent set. And I'm telling you, we can't recover from something like this. That's why the president should not sit down for an interview. That's why they should take it all the way up to the Supreme Court. That's why we cross our fingers and hope the Supreme Court knows what the hell it's doing. May not. When I get to this issue of the New York Times, Sulzberger family and the Oakes family have owned the New York Times since forever. So the kid inherited his newspaper, the whole company, which is not doing well financially, I don't believe. And this particular Sulzberger came into power, effectively, in January. And he meets with the president. The president tweets about it, and then he says, look, I told the president that he has to stop criticizing the press the way he's criticizing the press, or we're going to have some violence here. And I'm thinking, have you not seen the violence against Trump supporters? The brutal attacks on Trump supporters who aren't bothering anybody? The most recent one in Hollywood, where the Trump star was destroyed and some Trump supporters went there and they were met by a mob and attacked. Have they not seen Antifa, which is a Marxist left organization, and the violence, I mean, real violence that organization does? Have they not told Maxine Waters to cut it out? Or Cory Booker now to cut it out about getting into the face of your members of Congress? I mean, the left is violent. The left is violent. Conservatives are not violent. Don't confuse us with neo-Nazis and Klansmen. That's not us. Conservatives are not violent. The entire Tea Party movement, there's been no violence. Tens of thousands of people gathering peacefully, making their voices heard, lobbying their members of Congress. But for the New York Times publisher to meet with the President of the United States and then say he told the President, stop criticizing the press because you're going to create violence, is really shocking to me. I do not understand why the New York Times is an institution in this country, where all the other press types say they take their lead from the New York Times. Why all the graduates from journalism schools across the country want to work for the New York Times. They are working for a newspaper, and I've said it over and over again, a newspaper that was involved in one of the most egregious acts of any free press in our entire history. The cover-up of the Holocaust. There's the New York Times, printed in New York. It's called the New York Times. A well-known progressive newspaper. A well-known paper that supports Democrats almost exclusively. That purposely push stories about the Holocaust either to the back pages or refuse to report on them at all. An entire book has been written on this. A self-examination of the New York Times was done. I encourage you to Google it or Bing it or DuckDuck it or whatever and research it. How can the New York Times be the paper of record? How can the New York Times be the paper of any kind of a record? How is it reputable with a history like that? And that's not so long ago. And a newspaper that is going to cover up the Holocaust, because effectively that's what it did, how can it be relied on to tell the truth? It can't. And they were caught again. It's very strange. I've explained this to many of you out there who are not Jewish, who are Gentiles, or atheists and so forth, about leftists who are Jewish. How they do not support the country of Israel, which is a Jewish state. Bear with me on this. Over at the Daily Wire, they have a story. New York Times makes reportedly false claim about Israel's founder, refuses to offer a retraction. And it's this. They use David Ben-Gurion, one of its founders, its first prime minister, with a debunked quote talking about giving up land that it had conquered, quote unquote, in the Six-Day War. And yet a transcript of the discussion that Ben-Gurion had says no such thing. But still the New York Times went with it and will not correct it. Why is that? Why is that? The reason is simple. Because the New York Times is run by self-haters. That's what I call them, as you well know. That's why. And they do exist. These are people who put their political ideology ahead of all else. And by the way, you find it among certain Catholics, certain Protestants, all religions. But I'm explaining it. And this is why the New York Times does what the New York Times does. There is a guy running for the Senate in Texas. And Beto, whatever his name is. And he's been running around the state of Texas saying, look, I don't take PAC money and I don't support PACs and this, that, and the other thing. Turns out he does take PAC money. Turns out he did take PAC money. And he took it from an organization that's anti-Israel because more and more the Democrat Party and the left, this is where they're coming from. Is it not? Some of it is anti-Semitic, some of it is not. But it is a growing movement within the Democrat Party because of the left, and quite frankly because of our immigration policies too. Just telling you the truth. Can't get fired for the truth, can I? So this Beto guy, turns out he got money through and from an organization that spends its time attacking Israel and Israel's existence. And it's set up as a Jewish organization. The New York Times isn't going to report that. Guy's running against Ted Cruz in Texas. New York Times isn't going to report that. And when Hamas, a terrorist group recognized as such by the United States, does terrorist things on the Gaza Strip, which it controls completely and utterly, and pushes the women and children in the front, shooting at Israeli IDF, trying to burn the land around them, attacking people, and so forth and so on. News outlets like the New York Times play right into Hamas's hands because Hamas does this for publicity purposes. It has no care whatsoever about death, the people who die as a result of this. And news outlets like the New York Times are the mouthpieces for Hamas. This is why I say they have blood on their hands. Because these terrorist activities by these terrorist organizations that result in death and mayhem are done because they want nothing more than to draw the attention of the reporters and editors at the New York Times for front-page stories and editorial support. So the gall of Sulzberger meeting with Trump and then saying he told Trump that his criticism of the press will get somebody killed or injured or create violence. What a pathetic, pathetic operation it is. I'll be right back.